lại một ngôi mộ tập thể nữa. Ghi lại hết đi.
Vâng, quy mô thật kinh hoàng.
Hoàn tất báo cáo nhanh lên. Vâng thưa chỉ huy.
The ghosts after the war. When the war finally ended, Europe did not breathe relief. It exhaled dust ash and the smell of bodies buried beneath the thawing snow. Cities were silent except for the clatter of trucks hauling away rubble and the low murmur of soldiers who had forgotten how to speak softly. The Reich had fallen. Berlin was a grave of stone and smoke. But under the mud and broken bricks, something else stirred the truth. Across the Eastern Front from the Baltic Forest to the Black Sea, the ground was beginning to tell stories. As spring came in 1945, local farmers plowing their fields struck something hard, something that was not rock. They found skulls, bones still bound with rope-rusted shell casings, and layers of shoes, small shoes, children's sizes. The war was over, but the graves were just beginning to open. In those days, people called them the killing fields. They stretched for miles, nameless trenches that swallowed villages. Soviet investigators following the retreat of the German army began to dig. What they found was not the chaos of battle, but the precision of administration. The pits were measured, logged, recorded. The dead had been counted before they were buried. The men who had done this were not generals on the front lines. They wore black uniforms and carried clipboards as often as rifles. They called themselves Einsatzgruppen, special action groups. Their mission was not to fight the Red Army, but to erase entire populations. Jews, Roma communists, teachers, priests, anyone who might resist the dream of a pure Europe. Between 1941 and 1945, they murdered more than 1 million people, shot, buried, and forgotten under the snow. When Germany surrendered, the world wanted to move on. People were hungry, cities were in ruins, and soldiers wanted to go home. But for those who began to uncover the graves, there was no going back. Every bone they found asked the same question: who did this? And what would justice look like in a world already numb from killing? In May 1945, the Allies divided up what was left of Germany. In the West, American and British forces began collecting evidence for what would become the Nuremberg Trials. In the East, the Soviets conducted their own investigations, guided by fury more than law. For the first time in history, the world would attempt to put a system on trial to punish not only individuals, but an entire machinery of death. The first reports from the field read like bureaucratic nightmares. Soviet pathologists counted layers of victims' men, at the bottom women and children, on top bullets fired from above. Shell casings were stamped with German manufacturer codes. Witnesses spoke of trucks arriving at dawn, of soldiers laughing, of orders given by officers who wore the silver skull insignia of the SS. Each village told the same story, only the names changed. When Allied intelligence officers compared the testimonies, a pattern emerged. The killings were not spontaneous. They followed routes, timetables, and command structures. The Einsatzgruppen were not rogue units, they were policy. They were the first industrial killers of the modern era, the prototype for the extermination camps that followed. By late 1945, investigators had collected tens of thousands of pages of German reports so precise that the murderers themselves had documented their crimes. Each commander had signed his name beneath the number of dead. To them, it was administration. To the world, it was evidence. But in those first months after the war, most of the men responsible were still free. Some were hiding among refugees. Others had blended into the chaos of post-war Germany, shaving their heads, changing their names, claiming to be displaced farmers or teachers. A few had even been quietly absorbed into the new bureaucracies of the Allied zones, offering their skills in security and organization. The machinery of evil had dismantled itself and vanished into the crowd. Meanwhile, in the ruined cities, rumors spread among survivors. People spoke of black uniformed officers seen boarding trains to Austria or Denmark, of ships bound for South America, of priests issuing forged baptismal papers for SS men who could pay. The same systems that had killed millions were now helping the killers disappear. But not everyone forgot. In the offices of Allied intelligence, a handful of lawyers and historians began connecting the dots. They combed through captured documents, identifying signatures matching names to faces. They learned that the Einsatzgruppen had been divided into 4 main units, A, B, C, and D, each following behind the German army as it advanced east. Each left behind a trail of villages wiped from the map. The names of their leaders began to surface: Otto Ohlendorf, Paul Blobel, Franz Stahlecker, Erwin Schulz, Werner Braune. Educated men, lawyers, architects, doctors, men who had once studied ethics and order, now architects of annihilation. To their minds, it had all been logic statistics, logistics quotas. They killed not out of chaos, but with method. As the investigations deepened, one truth became clear: the killers had left a paper trail, and that trail led straight to them. But bringing them to justice would not be simple. Post-war Germany was unstable, and the Allies needed to rebuild, not reopen every wound. Many officials argued that it was time to forgive, to focus on reconstruction. The victims, they said, were gone. Nothing could bring them back. Still others refused to let silence settle over the graves. Journalists, prosecutors, and survivors began pushing for accountability. They published photographs of mass executions, testimonies from escaped witnesses, letters written by soldiers describing cleansing operations. Slowly, the myth of the obedient soldier began to crack. In the cold winter of 1946, the first Einsatzgruppen trials were prepared. 24 senior SS officers were charged with crimes against humanity. The evidence was overwhelming reports in their own handwriting orders signed with their seals. But in their defense statements, nearly all repeated the same line: "I was following orders." It was the oldest excuse in history, and it would echo through the courtroom like a ghost. For the men who dug up the bodies, there was no room for philosophy. They had seen the truth. They had smelled it. To them, justice was not about ideology. It was about memory. Every name uncovered, every bone cataloged, was a refusal to let the killers vanish. But while the world's attention turned to the spectacle of Nuremberg, thousands of lesser killers slipped away unnoticed. Rank and file shooters, drivers, clerks, the hands that had pulled triggers and signed off on supplies. They went home to their families, changed uniforms for civilian clothes, and tried to live as if nothing had happened. Some succeeded, some even prospered. In the years immediately after the war, Europe was full of ghosts that no one wanted to see. Not the ghosts of the dead, but the living ghosts, the men who had done the killing and were now walking freely among their former victims. Every train station, every marketplace, every quiet village held secrets. Justice, it seemed, would not come quickly. And yet, beneath the exhaustion and rubble, a slow awakening began. The Allies realized that forgetting was dangerous. Each unpunished crime was a seed of the next war. Each unspoken truth was a wound that would fester. The Einsatzgruppen could not simply vanish into history. They had to be named, exposed, remembered. By 1947, a phrase had begun to circulate among the investigators: "The hunters will become the hunted." It was more than a slogan, it was a vow. The years ahead would prove them right. From the ashes of Nuremberg to the prisons of Landsberg, from the forests of Latvia to the rivers of Ukraine, The search for the Einsatzgruppen would become one of the most relentless manhunts in history. Some would face trial and the noose. Others would vanish into the fog of post-war Europe. But all of them, whether hanged, shot, or hidden, would be haunted by the same truth: the dead never stop counting, because the earth remembers, and one day it begins to speak. The special action groups and the machinery of murder. They called them Einsatzgruppen Special Action Groups. The name sounded administrative, almost harmless. It could have belonged to a team of auditors, not executioners. Yet behind that title was the purest expression of bureaucratic murder ever conceived. Their origins lay not in the trenches, but in the offices of Berlin, specifically the Reich Main Security Office, or RSHA. It was Reinhard Heydrich, the man with the iron heart, who designed them. In June 1941, as Hitler prepared to invade the Soviet Union, Heydrich issued his infamous directive: the army would conquer territory. The Einsatzgruppen would cleanse it. Behind every German division would follow a small group of men whose orders were not to fight soldiers, but to eliminate undesirable elements. They were not large, usually between 500 and 1,000 men per unit, but they carried an authority far greater than their number. Each Einsatzgruppe had subunits called commandos, which fanned out through villages and towns in the wake of the advancing Wehrmacht. They worked closely with local police collaborators and military commanders. Together, they transformed the Eastern Front into a laboratory of organized slaughter. The plan was as cold as it was simple. Wherever the German army advanced, the Einsatzgruppen followed. They rounded up the Jewish population political commissars, Roma families, anyone deemed racially or ideologically dangerous. They gathered them in public squares, synagogues, or schoolyards under the pretext of relocation. Then they marched them to ravines, forests, or sand pits and shot them. It was not chaos. It was procedure. Reports were filed after every operation, meticulously typed summaries that listed the number of victims categorized by gender and age. These reports were sent to Berlin every week, often boasting of successful cleansings. In them, the murders became mathematics. 10,000 Jews in Kovno, 27,000 in Riga, 90,000 in Ukraine. Numbers without names, deaths without faces. The men who carried out these executions were not the monsters of myth. Many were educated professionals, lawyers, teachers, engineers, even pastors. They believed they were doing administrative work in service of the Reich. Killing became logistics: how to organize crowds, how to dig pits, how to ration bullets. Orders were delivered with the same tone one might use to discuss inventory. Witnesses later recalled how methodical it all was. Victims were told to undress and leave their belongings neatly in piles. They were made to lie face down in trenches. The shooters aimed carefully, 1 bullet per skull. Another group followed to cover the bodies with soil. Then the next batch was brought forward. All day without pause. At night, the soldiers drank. In the morning, they started again. By the end of 1941, the Einsatzgruppen had killed nearly 500,000 people, and yet to their superiors, it was not enough. The slaughter had to be faster, cleaner, quieter. Complaints reached Berlin about psychological strain on the shooters' men, unable to sleep, drinking heavily, breaking down in tears. The solution was technological. Heydrich ordered the creation of gas vans, sealed trucks fitted with exhaust pipes redirected into the cargo hold. Victims were told they were being relocated. Once the doors shut, the engine was started. Within 15 minutes, silence. Otto Ohlendorf, one of the most infamous commanders, would later describe these operations at Nuremberg in clinical detail. How gas vans were a more humane method that reduced the burden on execution squads. He spoke as if discussing a business improvement plan. He was proud of the efficiency, but even with the gas vans, the work of death remained intimate. There was no distance between killer and victim, no machinery to blur the act. The Einsatzgruppen were the last link in the chain before the death camps industrialized the process. They represented the face-to-face phase of genocide, when men still looked into the eyes of the people they killed. The soldiers filmed their work. They took photographs of firing lines of bodies in ravines of officers inspecting corpses. Some kept these images as trophies. Others mailed them home. Decades later, those photos would serve as evidence in court, the killers unwittingly documenting their own crimes. One report from Lithuania in late 1941 reads like an accountant's journal: executed 137,346 persons. Remaining Jewish population Sau Idrusn Varns. Beneath the line, the commander's signature, Jaeger. No emotion, just precision. To understand the Einsatzgruppen is to understand that genocide was not an accident of war. It was its purpose. These men were not rogue extremists. They were the logical product of Nazi ideology. The war in the East was never just about land. It was about purification, the creation of a new order cleansed of everything deemed un-German. The Einsatzgruppen were the vanguard of that vision. Their operations extended from the Baltic to the Black Sea. In Latvia, whole communities were wiped out in a single weekend. In Ukraine, the name Babi Yar became synonymous with horror: 33,771 Jews shot in 2 days. In Belarus, villages vanished completely, their names erased from maps. Wherever the Einsatzgruppen went, civilization ended. They did not act alone. Local collaborators, police auxiliaries, and nationalist militias joined the killings, often with enthusiasm. Sometimes the Einsatzgruppen provided only supervision, standing aside as villagers turned on their neighbors. The Nazis had discovered something even more efficient than bullets hate. As the tide of war turned in 1943, the Germans began to fear what would happen when these crimes were uncovered. The Einsatzgruppen were ordered to destroy the evidence. This became Action 1005, a secret program to exhume mass graves and burn the bodies. Paul Blobel, the architect of Babi Yar, was placed in charge. Under his direction, special teams dug up hundreds of thousands of corpses, fed them into makeshift cremation pits, crushed the bones, and scattered the ashes. It was an effort to erase history itself, but history resists erasure. The ground remembered. The air held the stench. Locals whispered of fires that burned without fuel, of fields that glowed at night. And after the war, those whispers led investigators back to the same places where they found layers of ash mixed with bone fragments. Each fragment, a story the killers had failed to silence. Inside the Nazi bureaucracy, the Einsatzgruppen were praised as pioneers. Their successes were used as data to plan the final solution more efficiently. Meetings in Berlin discussed methods, bullet consumption, and psychological management of personnel. By 1942, these lessons would be transferred to the gas chambers of Auschwitz and Treblinka. In that sense, the Einsatzgruppen were the blueprint of the rehearsal for genocide on an industrial scale. Yet behind the cold efficiency was decay. Soldiers wrote letters home describing dreams of the faces they'd shot. Some begged for reassignment. Others became violent, unstable, addicted to alcohol and morphine. Even among killers, the machinery of death consumed its own operators. By the final years of the war, the Einsatzgruppen themselves were disintegrating. Some units were absorbed into frontline divisions, others wiped out by partisans or the Red Army. Commanders began burning documents, bearing evidence, killing their own clerks to prevent leaks. They knew the reckoning would come, and it did. When the Allies advanced into Eastern Europe, they found the paper trail. The Nazis had recorded everything: dates, times, signatures, locations. The killers had documented themselves into a corner. Still, the question remained, how do you put a system on trial? How do you sentence men who claim they were only following orders written by ghosts above them? In the months after victory, as Nuremberg prepared its first hearings, prosecutors realized the Einsatzgruppen cases would be the true test. These were not generals commanding armies, but ordinary men commanding death squads. If they could be held accountable, perhaps humanity itself could draw a boundary, a line between obedience and evil. The trials that followed would make history. But before the gallows and verdicts, before the confessions and denials, there was the simple, brutal truth. Between 1941 and 1945, on the edges of fields and forests across Eastern Europe, the Einsatzgruppen murdered over 1 million people, not by accident, not in battle, but by deliberate, systematic design. And when the guns finally fell silent, they believed they could disappear into the ruins. They believed the world would forget. They were wrong, because beneath the soil of Europe, the numbers they left behind were not just statistics, they were voices, and those voices were waiting for someone to listen. The fall of the Reich, when the hunters became the hunted. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was no longer an empire, it was a carcass. Cities burned, the army fractured, and Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year reign had shriveled into the smoke rising from Berlin's ruins. The world watched as the once invincible machine of war broke down under its own weight. Yet within that collapse, a darker transformation was already unfolding. The killers who had enforced the Nazi vision men of the Einsatzgruppen were shedding their identities like snakes shedding skin. The hunters were preparing to vanish. As Allied troops marched east and Soviet forces stormed west, a new kind of war began, a war for escape. SS officers tore off their insignias, buried documents, and burned orders by the ton. Prison camps were emptied, trains rerouted, and convoys disappeared into the chaos of retreat. In the forests of Poland and Ukraine, Einsatzgruppen men disguised themselves as farmers, wandering refugees, or wounded soldiers. Some stole civilian clothes from the corpses of their own victims. In Berlin, during those final weeks, flames licked the walls of the Reich Chancellery, while secretaries shredded files until their fingers bled. Orders were given to destroy every trace of the operations in the East. But paper has a stubborn memory. Fragments survived in burned archives, abandoned offices, or forgotten briefcases stuffed with ledgers and maps. They would resurface later in the hands of investigators who refused to let the truth die with the Reich. When Hitler shot himself on April 30th, 1945, the world entered a strange silence. For 6 years, death had spoken in commands and parades. Now it was wordless. Across Europe, men who had believed themselves gods suddenly became fugitives. They were no longer defenders of the Reich. They were criminals without a country. American and British soldiers stumbled upon their work by accident. In Poland, patrols found ravines filled with bones, the earth rising and falling with the gas of decomposition. Soviet investigators discovered trenches so wide they seemed to swallow entire forests. Wherever the Einsatzgruppen had passed, the ground was scarred like a wound that would not close. Yet justice, at first, moved slowly. The Allies were overwhelmed, millions displaced, cities in ruins, borders erased. The primary mission was rebuilding, not revenge. Many captured Germans were interrogated briefly and released, deemed minor functionaries. In that chaos, hundreds of Einsatzgruppen officers walked free, blending into the masses of war refugees. Some were clever, adopting false names and new professions. Others simply relied on the world's exhaustion. But among the ruins, a few men and women refused to forget. Soviet investigators began exhuming the mass graves, counting bodies, recording evidence. They worked in the cold with shovels and notebooks surrounded by silence and flies. Each corpse was a witness, each shell casing a signature. They documented it all, dates, coordinates, bullet calibers, because they understood that history must be proven, not just told. In the western zones, the Americans and British established war crimes units to trace the architects of the genocide. At first, they focused on the well-known names Himmler, Goering, Goebbels, but as captured documents piled up, a new pattern emerged: thousands of signatures, all belonging to men from the Einsatzgruppen. Lawyers and historians began piecing together the puzzle. The same names kept appearing across reports from Latvia, Belarus, and Ukraine. The same cold phrasing, special treatment, liquidation, execution completed. It was a bureaucratic fingerprint of mass murder. Still, the hunt was difficult. Germany was a landscape of ruins and displaced millions. Even the guilty hid behind tragedy. Some SS officers posed as POWs or foreign laborers. Others faked death certificates and vanished into monasteries or rural farms. A few found help from sympathetic clergy and underground networks that would later become known as the Rat Lines escape routes, stretching from Bavaria to Italy, then to South America. But not everyone managed to flee. For those captured by the Allies, the reckoning began quickly. The Nuremberg Trials opened in late 1945, and for the first time in history, the world attempted to prosecute crimes against humanity. It was more than a legal term, it was a moral revolution. The idea that obedience could no longer shield a man from responsibility shook the foundations of military power. The early proceedings focused on the major war criminals, but soon attention turned toward the Einsatzgruppen. Prosecutors realized these men were not anonymous executioners. They were the living embodiment of ideology turned into action. If Germany's guilt had a face, it was theirs. Captured officers were interrogated under bright lights in converted army barracks. Many tried to appear calm, educated, even polite. They offered rehearsed lines: "I was following orders." It was wartime. If I had refused, I would have been shot. But the documents said otherwise. Their own reports betrayed them, lists of victims signed and stamped, the ink still dark. They had documented their crimes with the same precision they once used to organize them. The evidence was overwhelming. One American prosecutor called it an ocean of papers soaked in blood. But even with such proof, conviction was not guaranteed. Post-war politics clouded everything. The Western Allies, already worried about Soviet expansion, feared that endless trials would cripple Germany's recovery. The Cold War was dawning, and justice was beginning to compete with strategy. Meanwhile, in the Soviet-occupied zones, justice took a harsher form. Field tribunals condemned SS officers en masse. Trials were held in bombed-out courthouses or in open squares before crowds of survivors. Verdicts were swift, sentences final. Dozens of Einsatzgruppen men were executed within days of capture, shot by firing squads beside the same trenches where their victims had fallen. Yet even in death, the truth was complicated. Some men who had personally overseen thousands of murders escaped punishment entirely, while others who played smaller roles were executed on sight. History, it seemed, could not balance its own scales. In 1946, a Soviet investigator wrote in his diary, "The graves do not ask for vengeance. They ask for remembrance." Those words became a guiding principle for the Allied war crimes teams. Justice would be imperfect, but memory could not be. The tide turned again in 1947 when a young American lawyer named Benjamin Ferencz was assigned to review captured Nazi records. What he found changed everything. Dozens of binders from the SS security offices detailing Einsatzgruppen operations down to the last bullet. They killed over 1 million people, he later recalled, and wrote it down as if it were business accounting. Franz gathered the documents, prepared the indictments, and by September 1947, the Einsatzgruppen trial officially began in Nuremberg. 24 commanders stood in the dock. Behind them, black and white photographs of their crimes covered the courtroom walls. Rows of bodies in ravines. Children clinging to mothers, officers with pistols drawn. The defendants were calm, composed, even confident. They still believed in the old order in obedience as virtue, but the world had changed. The prosecution called witnesses villagers who had survived the mass shootings, soldiers who had refused to participate, clerks who had typed the death reports. Their testimonies pierced the courtroom's formality like cries from another world. One Ukrainian woman told of her husband and children shot before her eyes. Another spoke of the pit, where bodies moved for days after burial. The silence that followed was not legal, it was human. For the first time, the killers had to listen. When the verdicts were read in April 1948, 14 of the men were sentenced to death, the rest to long prison terms. Some would hang, others would rot behind stone walls. It was the first step toward justice, but not the last. The hunt was far from over. Thousands of names remained unaccounted for their owners, still hidden in plain sight. For every Ohlendorf or Blobel brought to trial, there were dozens more who walked freely under new names. They taught in schools, managed businesses, raised families. Their neighbors never knew. Sometimes the only clue was a scar, a photograph, a nightmare they couldn't hide. The war had ended, but the ghosts had not. The Einsatzgruppen had dissolved into the soil of post-war Europe, their crimes buried beneath politics and silence. Yet the silence could not last forever. Justice would find them, not all at once, not perfectly, but inevitably. Because history does not forget. It waits, it digs, and as the new Germany tried to rebuild itself from the ashes, the question still lingered heavier than any ruin. How many of the killers were still among the living? Otto Ohlendorf, the doctor of death, and his trial. He looked nothing like a mass murderer. When Otto Ohlendorf entered the courtroom at Nuremberg in 1947, he carried himself like a professor. Wire-rimmed glasses, neat hair, an almost delicate face. He spoke softly, precisely, as if giving a lecture rather than defending his life. But behind the calm tone and academic posture stood the man responsible for 90,000 deaths. Ohlendorf was not a brute. He was a lawyer, a scholar of economics, a man who could quote Kant while signing execution orders. He embodied a terrifying truth about the Nazi system, that intellect could coexist with evil, that genocide could be managed like an administrative department. Born in 1907 in the small German town of Hoheneggelsen, Ohlendorf was brilliant, ambitious, and loyal to the idea of order. He joined the Nazi Party in 1925, long before it was fashionable, and climbed quickly through the ranks of the SS. He saw himself as a moral man devoted not to cruelty, but to duty. That word would follow him to the gallows. By 1941, when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, Ohlendorf had become the commander of Einsatzgruppe D, the mobile killing unit assigned to southern Ukraine and Crimea. His task to secure the rear areas of the advancing German army, which in Nazi language meant exterminating Jews, Roma communists, and anyone else labeled an enemy of the Reich. He approached the mission like a bureaucrat, not a warrior. His reports read like balance sheets. Under his command, Einsatzgruppe D methodically annihilated entire towns' men by rifle fire, women and children by gas vans. the unit's operations stretched from the Black Sea to the Crimean Peninsula. When the Red Army pushed west, they left behind fields of bones and trenches filled with ash. At Nuremberg, Ohlendorf did not deny the killings. He described them in detail, how his men lined up the victims, how they fired in rows, how gas vans were used to minimize psychological strain on shooters. His tone was dry, detached, almost courteous. To him, it was policy. One observer wrote, "He spoke as if explaining how to run a factory efficiently." When asked whether he felt guilt, Ohlendorf replied that he did not. He argued that he had acted under orders from higher authorities, Reinhard Heydrich, Heinrich Himmler, and ultimately Adolf Hitler himself. Refusal, he claimed, would have meant death. He saw himself as a soldier of law, not conscience. But the prosecutors were ready. They confronted him with his own reports typed and signed by his hand. They read out the numbers aloud one after another. 500 in Kherson, 2,300 in Simferopol, 3,700 in Feodosia. The courtroom fell silent. Ohlendorf adjusted his glasses and nodded. "Those figures," he said, "are correct." He was asked how he reconciled such actions with his education, his belief in justice. His answer chilled everyone present. It was not justice in the abstract. It was the justice of the state. The state decides what is right. It was a sentence that defined the 20th century's darkest logic. To understand Ohlendorf is to understand how evil hides behind paperwork. He was not the man pulling the trigger. He was the one calculating how many bullets were needed. To him, mass murder was not chaos, but system. He once told an interviewer that he believed in clean methods, insisting that executions be conducted with dignity to spare the executioners undue distress. In his mind, he was preserving morality even as he destroyed humanity. His own men feared him. Survivors described him as calm but merciless, a man who could speak kindly to a child one moment and order its death the next. He demanded discipline, punctuality, and absolute obedience. When one of his officers hesitated during a firing operation, Ohlendorf reprimanded him, not for compassion, but for inefficiency. By the time Germany surrendered, Ohlendorf returned to his old desk job in Berlin's Reich security main office, as if the massacres were merely another chapter in his career. He was arrested by American troops in Flensburg on May 23, 1945. When questioned, he spoke freely, almost proudly, about his command. He saw no reason to hide. After all, he had followed orders. During the Einsatzgruppen trial, his defense lawyers tried to humanize him. They presented him as a loyal soldier, caught in the gears of a totalitarian machine. They argued that he had no choice, that disobedience meant death. But the prosecution dismantled that claim. They showed evidence of officers who had refused to participate and had not been executed, only reassigned. Ohlendorf had chosen his path. The judges saw through the veneer of intellect. On April 10, 1948, Otto Ohlendorf was found guilty of crimes against humanity and war crimes. The sentence, death by hanging. He spent 3 years on death row in Landsberg prison, the same prison where Hitler had once written Mein Kampf. Those years were spent writing essays and letters defending his worldview. He claimed he was misunderstood, that history would vindicate him. He compared himself to Socrates, to men condemned for serving truth rather than politics. The arrogance never left him. In one letter to his wife, he wrote, "I die not as a criminal, but as a man faithful to his duty." To the end, he refused to accept moral responsibility. The execution took place in the early morning hours of June 7, 1951. Guards led him from his cell to the gallows. Witnesses described his composure, steady steps, no trembling. When asked for final words, he replied simply, "Germany will live." At 1:28 a.m., the trapdoor opened. His body fell. The rope snapped taut, and the man who once considered himself the rational face of Nazi order swung into silence. There was no funeral, no ceremony. His remains were buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery. The dirt covered him quietly without speeches or banners, an ending far humbler than the empire he had served. Yet Ohlendorf's story did not end with his death. His testimony at Nuremberg became one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of the Einsatzgruppen's operations. In his precision, he inadvertently preserved the truth he tried to rationalize. Every statistic, every name he confirmed became part of the historical record that would outlive him. Historians still debate whether he believed his own justifications. Some say he was a fanatic, others that he was a man trapped in ideology too vast to question, but the facts remain under his command. 90,000 human beings ceased to exist. A former SS clerk who worked under him once said years later, he made murder sound like mathematics. You forgot you were killing people. That was Otto Ohlendorf's legacy, the transformation of murder into method of sin, into system. And when his body fell through the trapdoor that night in Landsberg, it was not only a man who died, but an illusion, the illusion that intellect can excuse atrocity, that obedience can wash away guilt. For the world watching his hanging was not just retribution, it was a warning. Evil does not always arrive with screams and fire. Sometimes it speaks in quiet sentences written in perfect grammar, signed in triplicate. And for every Otto Ohlendorf who faced the gallows, there were others waiting in the shadows, men just as educated, just as calm, who would soon take their turn before the world's judgment. Paul Blobel, the architect of the ashes. He was an architect by training. Before the war, Paul Blobel designed buildings, churches, houses, municipal offices. He was meticulous, disciplined, proud of his eye for symmetry. Later, when the Reich demanded it, he applied that same precision to the art of killing. What he built no longer stood above ground, it sank beneath it. By the time of his capture in 1945, Blobel was known to Allied investigators as the man who had overseen one of the largest single massacres of the Holocaust, the Babi Yar massacre outside Kiev. In 2 days, September 29th and 30th, 1941, his Einsatzkommando 4A, a subunit of Einsatzgruppe C, murdered 33 71 Jews. The killing ground was a ravine on the city's edge. The sound of gunfire echoed for miles. For 2 days straight, trucks brought in victims, men, women, children, the elderly, until the soil itself seemed to drink blood. Blobel personally supervised the operation. Witnesses later recalled him walking among the execution squads with a cigarette in hand, checking off figures in a notebook, as if auditing an account. He ordered the men to work faster, more efficiently. When the bodies piled too high, he had them layered like lumber. One row of corpses face down, another row face up to conserve space. The geometry of death. Before the war, he had been described as quiet, almost timid, with thinning hair and a nervous disposition. But war revealed something else. Under the ideology of racial cleansing, his architectural mind found a new purpose: how to construct the perfect system for annihilation. The ravine at Babi Yar was his masterpiece of horror. The massacre was so vast, so sudden, that even some German officers recoiled. One Wehrmacht soldier wrote in his diary, "I saw a child try to climb out of the pit. It was shot and fell back on the bodies of its parents." For Blobel, it was merely an operation completed ahead of schedule. After Babi Yar, he was promoted and given a new assignment that would define his legacy not as a builder of structures, but as the destroyer of evidence. By 1943, as the Red Army advanced and reports of Nazi atrocities reached the world, Berlin grew paranoid. Himmler ordered all traces of mass executions erased. The code name was Action 1005. Blobel, now trusted as both ruthless and efficient, was chosen to lead it. His task unearthed the bodies from hundreds of mass graves across occupied Europe and burn them. It was an impossible command, but Blobel approached it with the same clinical focus that had guided his architectural career. He designed the process himself, selecting locations, assembling teams, developing methods for rapid cremation. Under Blobel's direction, slave laborers, mostly Jewish prisoners from nearby camps, were forced to exhume decomposing corpses, stack them on grates of railway tracks and logs, and burn them day and night. The stench was unbearable. Prisoners were made to crush the remaining bones with hammers, scatter the ashes, and then dig new graves to conceal the evidence. When the work was done, Blobel's men executed the laborers and buried them atop the ashes of the dead. From June 1943 to July 1944, his program processed an estimated 700,000 corpses, 700,000 human beings reduced to ash, reburied, forgotten, until the earth was turned again. Blobel's efficiency impressed his superiors. Reports from the SS praised Action 1005 for its thorough execution. His teams operated in Poland, Belarus, the Baltics, and Ukraine. In his mind, he was cleaning the record-restoring order. What he truly achieved was to make the ground itself heavier with death. When the war ended, Blobel went into hiding. He was captured by American forces near Nuremberg in May 1945. At first, he denied everything, claiming he had served as a mere administrator. But investigators quickly uncovered documents bearing his signature, and photographs taken at Babi Yar confirmed his presence. His reputation as the architect of the ashes was sealed. At his trial, Blobel cut a pitiful figure. His hair had gone gray. His face sagged with exhaustion, but the arrogance remained. When prosecutors described the horror of Babi Yar, he shrugged. "I was following orders," he said. "It was necessary for the security of the troops." When confronted with testimony from survivors who had seen him overseeing the killings, Blobel grew defensive. He claimed he had been drunk during much of the operation and could not remember details. "The vodka was strong," he muttered, as if intoxication could wash away murder. But there were too many witnesses, too many reports. The evidence was unshakable. His meticulous record-keeping, the same habit that once made him a competent architect, had doomed him. In the courtroom, his own handwriting became his executioner. On April 10, 1948, the tribunal found him guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. His appeal was denied. The sentence was death by hanging. He spent 3 years in a small cell at Landsberg prison, the same cold walls that held Otto Ohlendorf. Guards recalled him as quiet, often sketching on scraps of paper. When asked what he drew, he said churches. The irony was too thick to breathe. In those final months, he requested a priest but gave no confession. He wrote a short letter to his wife and daughter, claiming he had only served his country. He ended it with "Pray that history will understand." At dawn on June 7, 1951, Paul Blobel walked to the gallows. He was executed 20 minutes after Ohlendorf. Witnesses said his final words were a prayer in Latin. When the trapdoor opened, his body dropped the ropes, snapping tight. The man who had once built homes, who had designed ways to erase the evidence of genocide, was gone in a heartbeat. No one claimed his remains. Prison officials cremated his body and scattered the ashes into the Isar River, the same kind of water into which he had once ordered the ashes of his victims dumped. The symbolism was haunting the current, carried him away, mixing the bones of the killer with those of the killed. But the story of Paul Blobel did not end in the prison morgue. His work, Action 1005, remained a central focus for post-war investigators. The program had nearly succeeded in erasing history. Without surviving documents and testimonies, the world might never have known the scale of the Einsatzgruppen's crimes. Yet, despite his efforts, the truth endured. Soviet investigators uncovered remnants of cremation pits, twisted rails, bone fragments scattered across fields. In the decades that followed, archaeologists and historians traced the map of Action 1005, the path of destruction that Blobel had orchestrated. The evidence told the story he tried to bury. In Kiev, the ravine at Babi Yar became a wound in the landscape impossible to heal. Locals said grass would not grow there properly for years. Birds avoided the area. The soil itself seemed restless. It was as if the ground remembered what he had done and refused to forgive. For the survivors, his trial brought little comfort. Justice was never enough to balance the scale, but it was something, a line in the sand, a signal to the world that even those who hid behind paper and procedure could not escape the weight of their deeds. Paul Blobel died believing he had erased his crimes. History proved otherwise. His reports, his sketches, his ashes all became part of the same record. The architect of death had built his own monument, not of stone, but of memory. And so the river carried him away, nameless, weightless. But somewhere downstream, the current still whispers his story, because water like truth cannot forget. Franz Stahlecker, justice by a bullet. In the hierarchy of death, Franz Walter Stahlecker stood near the top. He was a career officer, well-educated, coldly ambitious, a man who saw ideology as a profession. When he took command of Einsatzgruppe A in the summer of 1941, his orders were simple: follow the German army into the Baltic states and northern Russia and eliminate all racial and political enemies. In his first report to Berlin, dated October 15, 1941, he wrote with pride, "The goal of cleansing the Baltic states has been achieved. The Jewish question has been solved." Under his supervision, more than 229,000 people were killed in just 5 months. To him, these were accomplishments, not atrocities. The report included maps with small coffin symbols marking execution sites across Latvia and Lithuania. Next to each numbers were neatly written in ink, Saturni 25s and 40s, so each digit represented a life, but for Stahlecker, they were merely data points in the grand arithmetic of the Reich. He was not a frontline soldier. He was an administrator of death. Fluent in several languages, trained in law, and respected within the SS, Stahlecker approached his mission with legal precision. He believed that extermination required organization, and he was right. His efficiency turned the Baltic region into a graveyard in record time. In Riga, Kaunas, and Vilnius, his men executed entire Jewish communities in forests and sandpits. They coordinated with local collaborators, Latvian, Estonian, and Lithuanian auxiliaries, who assisted eagerly, driven by revenge or ideology. The shootings were public. Crowds gathered. Some looted clothing from the dead. Others cheered. Stahlecker watched it all unfold from his car clipboard, in hand, documenting the progress. His methods impressed Himmler. Reports from Einsatzgruppe A were circulated among SS leadership as models of efficiency and discipline. What these men called discipline, the world would later call genocide. Stahlecker had been groomed for power. Before the war, he had worked in the Gestapo and later in the Reich Security Main Office. He was ruthless but also politically astute, a man who understood how to climb. Yet his ambition carried him into the most dangerous terrain of the Eastern Front, where even his rank could not protect him forever. By the winter of 1942, the tides of war had begun to shift. Soviet partisans roamed the forests of Latvia and northern Russia. attacking German convoys and ambushing SS patrols. For the first time, the hunters were being hunted. Stahlecker traveled frequently between his field headquarters, accompanied by a small staff car and a handful of guards. He believed himself untouchable. He had survived bombings, skirmishes, and ambushes before. But in March 1942, his luck ran out. On the morning of March 23rd, his convoy was traveling near Kreslava in eastern Latvia when it was ambushed by Soviet partisans. The attack was sudden, violent, and over in minutes. A burst of gunfire tore through the car's windshield. Bullets struck Stahlecker in the chest and stomach. Witnesses said he slumped forward, clutching his briefcase, blood soaking his uniform. He died before his men could react. His guards fled, leaving his body on the roadside. When they returned later that day, they found him already frozen, his face half covered in snow. The SS retrieved his remains and flew them back to Berlin. There, the Reich honored him with a state funeral. Wreaths lined the coffin. High-ranking officers saluted. Eulogies praised his unwavering loyalty and sacrifice for Germany. Himmler himself sent a message of condolence, calling Stahlecker a hero who fell in the struggle against Bolshevism. But beneath the medals and speeches was irony. Stahlecker had spent his career orchestrating death in silence, believing justice could never reach him. Instead, it came not from a courtroom, but from the barrel of a gun fired by nameless men in the Forest Men who would never know whom they had killed that day. The SS buried him with full military honors in a Berlin cemetery. His tombstone bore his rank and the Iron Cross. But in 1944, Allied bombs leveled much of the city, and his grave was destroyed. When the cemetery was struck, the ground cracked open. The coffin splintered. Rain washed his bones into the rubble. There was no grave to visit. After that, no marker for those who might have remembered. Franz Stahlecker disappeared into the same kind of anonymity he had once imposed on his victims. In a strange, grim symmetry, his death mirrored the chaos he had unleashed. No trial, no speeches, no defense, just a few seconds of terror and silence. He died not as a martyr, but as one more casualty of the empire he helped build. When investigators later reviewed his reports after the war, they were stunned by the level of documentation. The Einsatzgruppe A files filled hundreds of pages, tables of killings categorized by age, gender, and location. There were even charts comparing progress between regions. It was genocide presented as management science. One page, dated October 31st, 1941, summarized his achievements. In Lithuania, all Jews excluding labor groups have been eliminated. In Latvia, the cleansing is nearly complete. A line below read, "Further operations in Estonia and northern Russia are proceeding according to plan." Those phrases, eliminated, cleansed, according to plan, were the language of his empire. In the decades that followed, historians and prosecutors used his reports as key evidence in the Einsatzgruppen trials. The documents bore his signature, elegant, precise, as if signing an architectural drawing. The courts read those pages aloud, transforming his words into testimony against the entire SS apparatus. Stahlecker never stood in the dock, but his paperwork did. It became his voice, his witness, his confession. For the survivors of the Baltic massacres, there was grim satisfaction in knowing that the man who had destroyed their communities did not escape unscathed. They called his death forest justice. A bullet fired by a partisan, perhaps, by someone who had lost a family in Riga or Kaunas, had done what the courts would later struggle to achieve. In the end, history did not need to try Franz Stahlecker. It buried him literally and symbolically beneath the ruins of the Reich he served. His reports survived, his bones did not. Justice in this case was simple: a gun in the woods, a grave without a name. The man who once wrote of cleansing Europe vanished into the dirt he had claimed to purify. The war moved on without him, but the ghosts he left behind did not. The forests of Latvia and Lithuania still whisper his story of trains arriving before dawn, of villages that never returned to the map of silence where prayers once rose. Franz Stahlecker died believing he was serving destiny. Instead, destiny served him a single merciless truth: every man eventually meets what he created. And for Stahlecker, that truth came in the form of gunfire in the snow. Erwin Schulz, the silence of the survivor. Not every executioner met the noose. Some, like Erwin Schulz, survived the war, the trials, and even their own conscience. His story is not one of defiance or redemption. It is a story of silence, the kind that lingers for decades after the screams have stopped. Erwin Schulz was not a monster in appearance. Born in Berlin in 1900, he came of age in the ruins of World War I, a young man searching for order in a nation drowning in humiliation and chaos. He found that order in the uniform of the police. 16 years in criminal investigation taught him discipline, procedure, and the importance of obedience. When the SS absorbed the German police under Himmler's reorganization, Schulz followed without question. He was not driven by ideology, at least not at first, only by habit. By 1941, he was 37 years old, married, meticulous, and respected by his peers. When the Reich prepared to invade the Soviet Union, Schulz was assigned to command Einsatzkommando 5, a subunit of Einsatzgruppe C, responsible for operations in central Ukraine. His orders were clear: security operations in newly conquered territories, the elimination of Jews, communists, and other undesirables. In August and September of that year, his unit reported the execution of 8,000 people in and around the town of Zhytomyr. The reports bore his signature, his initials neatly typed at the bottom. For a man trained in documentation, every death was recorded, filed, and transmitted up the chain of command. It was the same methodical precision he had once used to close murder cases, only now the victims were civilians, and the crime was his own. But something inside Schulz was different. While others under his command carried out their duties with chilling enthusiasm, he hesitated. He argued with his superiors, claiming that the execution of women and children was unnecessary. He proposed that only adult males capable of resistance should be targeted. His protest went nowhere. Orders were orders. The killing continued. In later testimony, Schulz claimed that he was disturbed by what he saw. He described visiting a site near Berdichev, where hundreds of Jews were lined up before an open pit. Soldiers fired in waves until the ground turned red. He said the sight haunted him, but haunted or not, he did not stop it. He signed the reports. He supervised logistics. He remained in command. By the autumn of 1941, the Eastern Front was collapsing into chaos, and Schulz requested transfer back to Germany, citing psychological strain. To his surprise, the request was granted. He returned to Berlin before the winter snows, his hands technically clean, though soaked in invisible blood. After the war, Schulz went into hiding like so many of his peers. But in October 1947, American investigators found him in a displaced persons camp near Munich, living under a false name. He had dyed his hair black and claimed to be a refugee from East Prussia. When they took his fingerprints, the truth surfaced within 2 days. The paper trail had found him again. At his trial, Schulz appeared calm, courteous, even remorseful. Unlike others who shouted their innocence or defended their ideology, he spoke softly and cooperated with the prosecution. He admitted that his unit had participated in mass executions. He did not deny the numbers: 8,000 dead in a matter of weeks. but he insisted that he had done what he could to limit excesses. The judges were unmoved. On April 10, 1948, the same day as Ohlendorf and Blobel, Erwin Schulz was convicted of crimes against humanity and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Compared to the death sentences handed to others, it was almost lenient. Some believed the court recognized that he had shown hesitation, a flicker of conscience, in a sea of obedience. He served 13 years in Landsberg prison. Guards described him as quiet, withdrawn, always reading. He never joined the political debates among the prisoners, never spoke of ideology or justice. When asked about the past, he would answer only it was war. In December 1961, the parole board released him. He was 61 years old. He returned to West Germany and found work as a bookkeeper, a man once responsible for thousands of deaths, now balancing columns of numbers for a small firm in Hamburg. His neighbors knew him as polite, punctual, and private. They never guessed who he had been. He lived another 20 years in anonymity. He never granted interviews, never spoke to historians, never wrote a memoir. His family burned his papers after his death in 1981. There was no funeral attended by journalists, no public record of his final thoughts. Only the official note Erwin Schulz, deceased, age 81, caused cancer. He had lived 34 years longer than most of his victims. Historians still debate how much remorse he felt, if any. Some believe he was genuinely tormented by what he saw in Ukraine. Others argue that his supposed conscience was only convenience, a way to distance himself from guilt when the Reich began to crumble. The truth is buried somewhere between the two, perhaps even in the silence he chose to maintain until his death. In the archives of the Einsatzgruppen trial, one line from his testimony stands out. When asked whether he believed what he did was wrong, Schulz replied, "I believed it was wrong for me, but necessary for the state." That sentence, quiet and unremarkable, carried the essence of the age, the idea that morality could be divided, that one could feel pity and still obey. Unlike Ohlendorf or Blobel, Schulz never sought to justify his actions. He simply folded them away like old documents locked in a drawer. Perhaps he hoped that if he never spoke of them, they would cease to exist. But history does not fade through silence. It only waits. Decades later, researchers tracking the fates of Einsatzgruppen officers found his name buried among post-war records. His life, they discovered, had been painfully ordinary. A small apartment, a modest pension, evenings spent listening to the radio. The banality of survival. He died quietly, surrounded not by judges or guards, but by family who may never have known the full truth. His grave, somewhere in Hamburg, bears no marker of who he was or what he commanded. Grass grows above him, and the world moves on. And yet, in the cold archives of Nuremberg, his name remains printed beside the words "Commanded Einsatzkommando." 5 $8,000 victims. That is the only memorial he left behind. Erwin Schulz escaped the rope, the bullet, and the fire. He escaped everything except time. Time which keeps its own record, because for every silence in history there is a voice beneath it. And one day, when the earth shifts, or a file is opened, or a researcher finds a name on a yellowed page, the silence breaks again. And we remember. Werner Braune, the dentist who became death. Before the war, Werner Braune's hands brought comfort. He was a dentist in Berlin, a man who eased pain, who told frightened patients to breathe, who filled cavities and steadied trembling jaws. He had a wife, 3 children, a quiet home, and the confidence of a man who believed the world was rational and controllable. But the Reich had other uses for hands that could work precisely. By 1941, those same hands no longer healed. They pointed, directed, and signed the orders that condemned 11,000 people to death. Braune's story is one of transformation, not from good to evil, but from ordinary to obedient. He was born in 1909, educated, intelligent, articulate. Like many of his generation, he joined the Nazi Party early, swept up by its promises of stability and national renewal. His dental practice prospered under the new regime. His patients included SS officers and local officials. When Himmler expanded the SS's internal network of educated men, Braune was recruited. They needed thinkers, not just fighters. He trained in the Reich security main office and rose quickly. He was precise, punctual, and loyal, all qualities valued by a system built on control. And when the order came to form the Einsatzgruppen, Braune's name appeared among the chosen. He was appointed commander of Einsatzkommando 11B, a subunit of Einsatzgruppe D, under Otto Ohlendorf. His area of responsibility, southern Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula. His mission to eliminate Jews, Roma communists, and Soviet prisoners of war. It was 1941. The Eastern Front was burning, and in the shadow of that fire, mass murder became daily routine. Braune approached his assignment as he once approached his dental work, with method and efficiency. His men admired his discipline. He gave clear orders, avoided unnecessary outbursts, and demanded precision. But where once he instructed assistants to pass him forceps, he now instructed soldiers to ready rifles. The transition was smooth. That was the horror of it. Between October 1941 and May 1942, his unit reported the execution of more than 11,000 people. The records show columns of numbers typed cleanly bearing his signature at the bottom. To Berlin, they were proof of success. Witnesses later described him as calm and detached, rarely emotional. During executions, he would stand at a distance smoking a cigarette, observing, as if inspecting the alignment of a row of teeth. Victims were lined up at the edges of pits and shot in waves. Children were sometimes thrown in alive. His men remembered him warning, "We must be thorough. The future depends on it." When the tide of war shifted and the Red Army began pushing back, Braune's world collapsed. In the summer of 1942, during the battle for Sevastopol, Soviet forces captured him. He was sent to a prisoner of war camp near Stalingrad, where he worked in the medical section treating wounded German soldiers, irony so sharp it could cut through bone. The man who had ordered thousands of executions was now bandaging the dying. He remained in Soviet captivity for 3 years. When the war ended, the Soviets handed him over to the Americans as part of a prisoner exchange. In 1945, he was brought to Germany, where investigators quickly realized who he was. His name appeared in multiple Einsatzgruppen reports. His signature was undeniable. At Nuremberg, he was placed alongside Ohlendorf and Blobel in the dock. The courtroom was silent when his crimes were read aloud. Thousands of murders, towns, erased villages emptied. Braune listened expressionless. When given a chance to speak, he delivered a short statement. "I served the state. I did my duty." His defense argued that his medical background made him unsuited for brutality, that he had simply followed superior orders, that he had attempted to minimize casualties where possible. The judges found the argument obscene. The evidence was overwhelming: eyewitness accounts, field reports, and his own admissions. Survivors from Crimea testified that he had personally attended executions and that his orders were absolute. In April 1948, the tribunal pronounced its verdict guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Sentenced death by hanging. Braune spent the next 3 years in Landsberg prison. Guards recalled him as polite, courteous, and eerily composed. He spent much of his time reading philosophy and religious texts. Some said he sought spiritual peace. Others believed he was rehearsing the role of martyrdom. He never expressed remorse. When asked if he regretted his actions, he replied, "I regret that Germany lost the war." In the early hours of June 7, 1951, the hangman's list contained his name, one of 6 Einsatzgruppen officers scheduled to die that morning. At 2:43 a.m., Braune was led from his cell. Witnesses said he walked with confidence, head held high. When the rope was placed around his neck, he whispered something under his breath, perhaps a prayer. Then the lever was pulled. The drop was short, the sound abrupt. His body jerked once and went still. They left him hanging for 20 minutes before cutting him down. Like the others, his remains were cremated, the ashes scattered in a stream that fed the Danube. The river carried him away. His trace dissolved among the fish bones and silt, just as his victims' remains had once been scattered by his command. The records close there. One more Nazi officer executed another line in the ledger of post-war justice. But the story does not end neatly. Years later, in interviews with guards and witnesses, a question lingered. How could a man trained to heal turn so easily toward killing? Was it ideology, fear, ambition, or the simple pull of obedience? The answer perhaps lies in the same instinct that led many ordinary professionals, lawyers, doctors, teachers to serve the Reich without hesitation. The system rewarded those who obeyed and punished those who questioned. Braune, like countless others, mistook obedience for virtue. Historians studying his letters found no trace of guilt, no acknowledgement of the human beings behind the statistics. In his mind, he had fulfilled his role, that more than his cruelty defined him. After his death, survivors in Ukraine and Crimea held small commemorations. In Sevastopol, near one of the execution sites, his unit had used an old woman lit a candle beside the pit. When asked why she came, she said, "Because the man who killed my brother is gone now, but the earth still remembers him." Werner Braune left behind no grave, no legacy, no monument, only his name in the archives and the echo of the oath he took to the Reich. He was the embodiment of a terrible equation intelligence without conscience, skill without soul. The rope that ended his life did not balance the scales, but it marked a moment when humanity drew a line in the ash and said, "Enough." He was the 6th man to hang that morning. When his body was cut down, dawn was breaking outside the prison walls. The guards poured the ashes into the river, and the water swallowed the evidence, as it always does, quietly, steadily, without judgment. But the rivers of Europe have long memories, and somewhere in their depths, the echoes of his crimes still drift part of the current that never stops moving, part of the story that cannot be washed away. The post-war trials justice in the rubble. The war ended, but the killing did not. It lingered in photographs and testimonies in the black soil of Eastern Europe, where bones still rose after the rain. The guns were silent, yet the truth screamed from the ground. And so, amid ruins and hunger, humanity tried to do something it had never done before: judge itself. The Einsatzgruppen trials were born out of that impossible ambition. Between 1945 and 1948, the Allies established a tribunal at Nuremberg to prosecute the architects of genocide. For the first time in history, war crimes would not be treated as the spoils of victory, but as crimes against humanity itself. The accused would not be enemy soldiers. They would be bureaucrats, lawyers, teachers, and doctors who had turned law and science into instruments of death. Among them were the men whose names the world now knew: Otto Ohlendorf, Paul Blobel, Werner Braune, and others whose signatures had once authorized the extermination of thousands. They had built the system of annihilation, and now that system was on trial. In the shattered city of Nuremberg, the courtroom stood like an island of order in a sea of destruction. The roof was patched with tar paper, the lights flickered, and winter air seeped through the cracks. Outside, starving civilians bartered cigarettes for bread. Inside, translators, stenographers, and judges worked by candlelight to record history. The proceedings began in September 1947. 24 defendants sat in the dock, former SS officers who had commanded Einsatzgruppen units across Eastern Europe. Their crimes had already been proven in documents, detailed reports of mass executions, typed with military precision, signed and delivered weekly to Berlin. The evidence was their own words. Benjamin Ferenc, a 27-year-old American prosecutor, stood before them. He was small, calm, and unyielding. These men, he said, are not soldiers. They are mass murderers. The world cannot tolerate their crimes. Law must replace war. The courtroom was silent. Behind glass, journalists scribbled notes. Some of the defendants looked bored, others defiant. A few smirked. They had lived their lives believing in hierarchy, believing that orders justified anything. They did not yet understand that the world had changed. Ferenc presented hundreds of documents, Einsatzgruppen operational reports that listed the daily progress of killing operations. One read, executed 137, 346 persons. Remaining Jewish population negligible. Each line was an indictment, each number a life. The documents had been recovered from SS archives, where the killers themselves had filed them for record keeping. The defendants claimed obedience. I was following orders they repeated. It was war. I had no choice. But Ferenc's argument was simple. Following orders is not a defense when the orders themselves are criminal. The court agreed. The principle of individual responsibility, that a man is accountable for his actions, even under command, was carved into the foundation of international law. Witnesses took the stand. Survivors from Ukraine and the Baltics spoke through interpreters. They described men in black uniforms arriving in their villages at dawn, forcing families to undress, lining them along ravines, shooting until the pits overflowed. Some fainted as they spoke. Others cried without tears, their voices dry from grief. One woman, a survivor of the Rubble massacre in Latvia, testified, "The ground moved for 3 days. You could hear them breathing under the soil." The defendants shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, perhaps, they were hearing the sound of their own ghosts. The judges listened to it all, the evidence, the arguments, the excuses. Some days, the courtroom smelled of sweat and fear. Other days, it was so quiet you could hear the scratching of pens. The world outside had already moved on to rebuilding, but inside that room, time was held still, frozen at the moment between order and atrocity, between civilization and its collapse. On April 10, 1948, after months of testimony, the verdicts were delivered. 14 of the 24 men were sentenced to death by hanging. The rest received long prison terms. Among those condemned were Ohlendorf, Blobel, and Braune. When the sentences were read, none of them showed emotion. They sat like statues, the discipline of the SS still clinging to them. One man whispered that he would appeal to a higher authority. Another crossed himself, but the law of humanity had spoken. Outside, snow began to fall, again covering the ruins of the city. The world had witnessed justice, imperfect, fragile, but real. Yet even as the gallows were built, new shadows began to gather. The Cold War was dawning, and the politics of justice started to shift. The Western Allies, fearful of Soviet expansion, sought to stabilize West Germany quickly. They needed allies, not endless trials. Public opinion, too, was changing. Germans wanted to rebuild, to forget. Many saw the trials not as justice, but as humiliation. By 1951, pressure mounted to end the executions. The U.S. High Commissioner for Germany reviewed the remaining sentences. Some were reduced to life imprisonment. Others were commuted entirely. political necessity began to outweigh moral clarity. Still, 6 men met their end on June 7, 1951 at Landsberg Prison. The same morning, the ropes claimed Ohlendorf, Blobel, and Braune. The others watched from their cells as the guards came for them one by one. The hangings were carried out efficiently without ceremony. When it was over, the guards recorded the time 8 executions in less than an hour. For the families of the victims, the executions were both justice and emptiness. The dead could not return. The weight of loss remained, but for a brief moment it felt as though history had turned its face toward truth. After that morning, the world moved on. West Germany entered an economic miracle, rebuilding cities and factories. The Einsatzgruppen faded from conversation. Their crimes became footnotes in textbooks, their names reduced to lines in archives. But the justice system did not forget entirely. Between 1958 and 1988, West German prosecutors reopened over 900 cases involving former Einsatzgruppen members. The Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes in Ludwigsburg was established to continue the hunt. The work was slow and grueling. Decades after the war, witnesses were dying, memories fading, and evidence scattered across continents. Yet the investigators persisted. Some trials dragged on for years. The defendants were old men, by then frail and soft-spoken. They appeared in court with canes and hearing aids claiming memory loss. But the records were clear. Names, signatures, dates, all preserved in Nazi precision. In one case, a former Einsatzgruppen officer stood trial in Hamburg in the 1960s. When asked whether he remembered ordering the execution of hundreds of Jews near Minsk, he replied, "I recall the operation, but not the individuals." The prosecutor responded quietly, "Neither do they." That silence filled the room. Justice was imperfect, often delayed, sometimes denied, but it endured. The principle that emerged from those trials shaped the post-war world. It established that war could no longer excuse cruelty, that nations could no longer hide behind sovereignty to justify slaughter. It laid the groundwork for future tribunals from Rwanda to The Hague. The idea that no one is above accountability became part of human law. Still, for every man tried, dozens escaped. Some fled to Argentina, Canada, Brazil. Others lived quietly in Germany, their pasts unspoken. They became shopkeepers, teachers, accountants. Their neighbors never knew that the polite old man who fed birds in the park once commanded firing squads in the East. When those men died, their obituaries said nothing of the war. But the archives knew. The paper trail never lied. In the end, the Einsatzgruppen trials were less about punishment than remembrance. They forced humanity to confront the question it least wanted to ask: how could civilization descend so quickly into methodical murder? The answer, as those documents showed, was not madness or chaos. It was obedience, bureaucracy, and belief. Justice in the rubble was not about vengeance. It was about drawing a line. The world would not stay silent again. And yet, beneath the rebuilt cities and the bright streets of post-war Germany, the soil still held its secrets. Each foundation laid upon the ruins of the past rested on bones. Each courthouse, each apartment block, each flower garden stood atop unmarked graves. The gallows at Landsberg were dismantled long ago. The ropes were burned, the records stored, but the wind that once swept through those open courtyards still carries the same whisper. Remember, because justice, no matter how delayed or incomplete, is not measured by the hangman's knot. It is measured by memory, by the refusal to forget. The ones who escaped shadows of the new Germany, the Nuremberg gallows, silenced some voices, but not all. When the hangman's rope was coiled away and the cameras stopped rolling, thousands of men who had served in the Einsatzgruppen quietly melted into the new world. They slipped through the cracks of post-war chaos through refugee camps, forged papers, and sympathetic networks. For every executioner who swung at Landsberg, 20 more lived to see the dawn of a new Germany. Their escape was not dramatic. There were no daring flights across borders or underground tunnels. Most simply changed their names, traded their uniforms for workers' clothes, and joined the millions of displaced Germans moving west. The sheer scale of post-war displacement worked in their favor. In the ruins of 1945, there were too many faces, too many lies, and too few questions. Some of them used their education to rebuild lives that looked respectable. Former SS officers became lawyers, civil servants, and even police officials in the young Federal Republic. Others found refuge in small towns where no one cared about the past as long as they paid their taxes and attended church on Sundays. Germany was exhausted. It wanted bread, not blood. Among these ghosts were men like Martin Sandberger, once commander of Einsatzkommando 1A in Estonia. He had been sentenced to death at Nuremberg in 1948 for organizing the murder of more than 2,500 Jews and Soviet officials. But in 1954, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, and by 1958, he was free. He returned to Stuttgart, resumed his legal career, and practiced commercial law until his death in 2010. He lived to 96 longer than most of his victims had been alive when he ordered their deaths. Or Gustav Noske, who had commanded Einsatzkommando 12. He was captured, released, then rejoined the West German police in the 1950s, rising to the rank of commissioner. It was not until 1964, almost 20 years later, that an old subordinate testified about his role in the mass shootings of Jews and communists in Western Russia. Noske was finally tried and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1970, but he served only 10 years before dying quietly in prison. Others escaped justice altogether. Alfred Filbert, commander of Einsatzkommando 9, killed 46,000 people in Belarus by 1941. After the war, he worked openly as a lawyer in West Germany under his own name. For 17 years, no one asked questions. In 1962, investigators finally tracked him down. His trial lasted 4 years. He was sentenced to life in prison, but released after 12. He returned to his law practice and died in 1990, 45 years after the last of his victims fell into the graves outside Minsk. These men did not live as fugitives in the shadows. They lived among ordinary people in neighborhoods, offices, and schools in a country eager to forget. West Germany in the 1950s was a nation reborn. Factories hummed, streets were rebuilt, and children played in parks where ruins had once stood. The economic miracle transformed the landscape, but it also buried the memory of guilt beneath layers of prosperity. Few wanted to look back. Politicians spoke of moving forward, of reconciliation. For many, that meant silence. It was not only the criminals who stayed quiet. It was their neighbors, their co-workers, sometimes even their victims. In a small Bavarian town, a retired civil servant named Hans Bauer lived peacefully for decades. Only after his death did historians discover he had served as an Einsatzgruppen clerk who typed execution lists. The people who had known him were stunned. He was kind, they said. He loved children. That sentence, the refrain of post-war Germany, became the country's uneasy lullaby. He loved children. He was kind. He was following orders. The truth is, evil had learned to smile. The machinery of forgetting was not accidental. Western governments preoccupied with the Soviet threat began to see the former Nazis as useful allies against communism. scientists, intelligence officers, and even police administrators with dark pasts were quietly integrated into the new system. Files were sealed, prosecutions stalled, justice once so loud fell silent under the hum of progress. But not everyone was willing to forget. In the 1960s, a new generation began to dig literally and figuratively. Young Germans raised in peace started asking their parents questions. Where were you during the war? What did you do? The answers were vague, evasive, sometimes angry. The silence of one generation became the rebellion of another. Amid that growing unrest, investigators at the Central Office for Nazi Crimes reopened old cases. They exhumed files, cross-referenced names, and followed the paper trails left decades earlier by the Nazis' own obsession with record-keeping. Piece by piece, the web of complicity was revealed. Some of those hunted down were very old men by then, their hands shaking as they faced courtrooms filled with the children and grandchildren of their victims. The trials were quiet, procedural, nothing like Nuremberg's grand theater of justice. Yet they mattered. Each one was a crack in the facade of post-war amnesia. One such case was John Demjanjuk, a Ukrainian guard who had served at Sobibor death camp and alongside Einsatzgruppen units in Ukraine. He had emigrated to the United States after the war, living for decades as an auto worker in Ohio. In 2009, at age 89, he was extradited to Germany and tried as an accessory to 28,000 murders. His conviction came in 2011. He died the following year in a nursing home while appealing the verdict. Even then, justice had arrived too late, but it had arrived. Others faced their reckoning in even stranger ways. In 1996, construction workers in Riga uncovered a mass grave containing the bones of Heinrich Loos, a Nazi administrator who had coordinated Einsatzgruppen operations in the Baltic states. Soviet forces had secretly executed him in 1946, but his death had never been recorded. For 50 years, his body lay beneath an industrial yard waiting for discovery. The Earth, as always, kept its records. Not all escaped through time. Some escaped through death itself. Heinrich Himmler swallowed a cyanide capsule in British custody. Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of the Einsatzgruppen, was assassinated by Czech resistance fighters. Adolf Eichmann fled to Argentina and lived freely until Israeli agents kidnapped him in 1960. He was tried in Jerusalem and hanged in 1962. Even decades later, the echoes of the Einsatzgruppen's crimes reverberated through those courtroom walls. The world's pursuit of these men was not only about punishment, it was about proof. Each trial, each conviction was a reaffirmation that history could not be rewritten by silence or convenience. But justice was never total. Of the more than 3,000 men who served in the Einsatzgruppen, fewer than half were ever prosecuted. Many died of old age in their beds, surrounded by grandchildren who never knew what their grandfathers had done. In one letter discovered years later, a retired SS officer wrote to a friend, "I think of the past sometimes. It feels like a dream. I try not to dwell." That line captures the paradox of post-war Germany, a nation rebuilding itself on foundations of denial. The ghosts of the Einsatzgruppen did not haunt Europe as wailing spirits. They haunted it as absence, as silence, as the missing names on family trees, and the unspoken stories behind old photographs. Still, memory has a way of returning. In 2016, the last major trial related to the Einsatzgruppen concluded in Hamburg. Oskar Gröning, known as the bookkeeper of Auschwitz, was convicted as an accessory to 300,000 murders. He had been 19 during the war. He died before serving a single day in prison, but the verdict stood. 70 years after the first mass shootings in Ukraine, The final echoes of justice had reached the last living witnesses of that era. The reckoning was never complete. It never could be, but it proved something vital, that even the most ordinary lives, the ones that hide behind smiles and titles, can cast shadows that stretch for generations. For the Einsatzgruppen, the war never truly ended. It followed them in nightmares, in the eyes of strangers, in the weight of the names that would not stay buried. And for Germany, the shadow of those men remained. It lingered in the collective conscience, a reminder that civilization's fall does not require monsters, only men who choose to obey. The years have softened the ruins, rebuilt the cities, and blurred the faces. But beneath the streets of Berlin, beneath the forests of Latvia, beneath the fields of Ukraine, the past still breathes. The earth, after all, has a perfect memory. And one day, it always tells the truth. The ghost hunters chasing shadows. Across decades, justice-like memory is stubborn. It moves slowly, but it never forgets its target. When the governments of the world lost interest in the war's unfinished business, a handful of people refused to let the trail go cold. They were journalists, lawyers, and survivors who made it their life's work to hunt the ghosts of the Einsatzgruppen men who had changed names, grown old, and believed time would shield them from consequence. These were the Nazi hunters. No army backed them, no nation paid them. They worked from cluttered offices and borrowed typewriters, guided only by faith that truth could still matter. Among them, one name became legend: Simon Wiesenthal. Wiesenthal had been a prisoner himself, an architect before the war, a skeleton after it. When the Americans liberated Mauthausen in 1945, he weighed 90 pounds. His entire family had been murdered, most by Einsatzgruppen units operating in Ukraine. But instead of returning to a quiet life, he chose pursuit. Survival is meaningless without memory, he once said. The dead have no voice unless we speak for them. From a small apartment in Vienna, Wiesenthal began gathering information, rumors, whispers, fragments of documents. He built his own archives long before official ones existed. With nothing but persistence and a Rolodex, he traced the paths of men who had vanished across oceans. He learned how the rat lines, the clandestine escape networks of ex-SS members, operated through monasteries, seaports, and sympathetic governments in Spain, Italy, and Argentina. Many of the Einsatzgruppen officers had fled this way, aided by false passports and forged Red Cross papers. Some found refuge in South America. Others lived openly in Canada or the United States, their crimes forgotten amid the Cold War's shifting priorities. Wiesenthal's first great victory came in the 1950s when his information helped locate Adolf Eichmann, the chief logistician of the Holocaust, living under a false name in Buenos Aires. It was not the Einsatzgruppen themselves, but the man who had supplied them with trains and orders. In 1960, Israeli agents from Mossad captured Eichmann and smuggled him to Jerusalem for trial. The operation electrified the world. Cameras recorded every word as Eichmann, thin and expressionless behind bulletproof glass, uttered the same defense the Einsatzgruppen had made at Nuremberg: "I was following orders." His hanging in 1962 proved that time was not an eraser. It was a reminder to the fugitives still hiding that someone was still watching. But Wiesenthal's work was only one part of a larger pursuit. Across Europe, others carried the same torch. In Poland and the Soviet Union, historians and archivists dug through forgotten documents, uncovering names and places that Western prosecutors had missed. In Israel, survivors formed organizations dedicated to identifying collaborators and guards. In Germany, a new generation of lawyers joined the fight, driven not by vengeance, but by duty to the truth. Among them was Fritz Bauer, a German Jewish prosecutor who risked his career to expose former Nazis hidden within the government itself. It was Bauer who secretly provided information to Mossad about Eichmann's whereabouts, an act considered treason by some of his colleagues. Where law ends, he said, there begins the struggle for justice. The work was exhausting. Decades after the war, witnesses were dying, memories fading. Evidence was scattered across continents, often buried behind walls of bureaucracy or political convenience. Governments wanted to move on. The hunters refused. By the 1970s, Wiesenthal and his small network had tracked down hundreds of fugitives. Some were living under assumed names. Others had risen to comfortable positions in new societies. There was Josef Schwamberger, a former Einsatzgruppen officer turned factory manager in Argentina. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, who had worked with U.S. intelligence after the war before fleeing to Bolivia. Each arrest reignited public awareness, forcing the world to look again at the faces it had tried to forget. The hunters were not always welcomed. In post-war Europe, many saw them as disturbers of peace, reopening wounds best left sealed. Newspapers accused them of obsession. Politicians spoke of reconciliation. Wiesenthal answered quietly, "There is no peace built on forgetting." Meanwhile, in West Germany, the Central Office for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes continued its slow, methodical work. Investigators traveled to remote villages in Poland and the Baltics, interviewing elderly witnesses who still remembered the day the black uniformed men came. They cross-checked testimonies with Nazi records and forensic evidence from old mass graves. Their offices were filled with maps dotted in red, each dot a place where the Einsatzgruppen had killed. In one room sat shelves of files labeled with names Ohlendorf, Blobel, Braune, Filbert, Noske, Sandberger. Many of the men were already dead, but the files remained open because their stories had not yet been told. It was not only about catching criminals anymore. It was about building memory case by case so that the machinery of denial could never run again. In Israel, Mossad established a specialized unit for high-value Nazi fugitives. Its most famous mission after Eichmann was the pursuit of Herbert Kukurs, a Latvian SS officer who had participated in the mass murder of Jews in Riga under Einsatzgruppe A. Kukurs lived openly in Brazil as an aviator and entrepreneur. In 1965, Mossad agents lured him to Uruguay under false pretenses and executed him. They left a note beside his body. "Those who will never forget have found you." The message was brutal but clear. The era of impunity was over. For every fugitive captured, however many more evaded the net. Some died peacefully in their beds, their crimes unexposed. Others slipped into oblivion, their names lost as archives crumbled and witnesses died. The hunters could not find them all, but they found enough to prove a point. There is no statute of limitations on truth. As the decades passed, Wiesenthal's hair turned white, his eyesight dimmed, but his resolve never weakened. In his 80s, he still came to his office every morning, still reading letters from survivors, still following trails. "If there is one thing the Nazis taught me," he said, "it's patience." He died in 2005 at the age of 96. His archive contained over 300,000 files each, a fragment of a crime, each a record of a life taken or a killer found. The collection became one of the most comprehensive repositories of Nazi history in existence. The last generation of Einsatzgruppe men lived to see their names reappear in books, documentaries, and trial transcripts. Some pretended ignorance, others denied everything, but the evidence was there in black and white, typed by their own clerks, signed by their own hands. In the 1990s, forensic teams returned to the killing sites in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics. They unearthed bones, bullets, children's shoes. The ground that had swallowed the truth now gave it back, piece by piece. The excavations matched the reports, exactly proof that the hunters had been right all along. Justice, though incomplete, had achieved something remarkable. It had turned forgetting into a crime of its own. In the end, the hunters were not chasing men. They were chasing meaning. They were ensuring that the abyss into which the Einsatzgruppen had thrown their victims did not swallow history itself. And though the last of the killers died old and soft, their peace was haunted by the persistence of those who refused to stop digging. Because the past, no matter how deeply buried, has a pulse. And if you listen long enough, if you refuse to look away, you can still hear it beating beneath the silence. The final Reckonings trials in the Twilight years. By the time the last Einsatzgruppen trials began, the killers were old men. Their hair was white, their bodies frail, their hands shaking not from fear, but from age. Some arrived in wheelchairs, others on stretchers, oxygen tubes in their noses. They looked harmless, like grandfathers in the twilight of life. But behind those tired eyes lay the same faces that had once commanded firing squads. The 1980s and 1990s marked the final chapter in a pursuit that had stretched across generations. The world that had once burned now moved at a quieter pace. Satellite news divided Germany, the Cold War thawing. Yet beneath the calm investigators still worked combing through dusty files, matching signatures, tracing rumors whispered in retirement homes. They knew time was running out, not only for the criminals, but for the witnesses. Every year, another voice fell silent, and yet the trials continued. One of the most significant cases was that of John Demjanjuk, a Ukrainian guard who had worked at Sobibor death camp and alongside Einsatzgruppen units in occupied Ukraine. For decades, he lived in Ohio, working in an auto factory, raising a family, attending church. His neighbors described him as polite, quiet, a man who mowed his lawn every Sunday. But in 2009, at 89 years old, he was extradited to Germany and charged as an accessory to 28,000 murders. The courtroom was a strange theater of contrasts. Demjanjuk in a wheelchair beneath fluorescent lights, prosecutors speaking into microphones, survivors testifying through interpreters. The past and present seemed to collide in that sterile room. The evidence was meticulous: camp rosters, transport lists, identification cards. Prosecutors argued that participation in a system of extermination was itself a crime. You didn't have to pull the trigger. Being part of the machine was enough. In 2011, he was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He died the following year in a nursing home while appealing his case. The verdict was never overturned. It was a small victory, but a symbolic one. It showed that even 70 years later, justice could still reach beyond the grave. In 2015, another name emerged from the darkness: Oskar Gröning, known as the bookkeeper of Auschwitz. He had been 19 when he joined the SS and was assigned to process valuables and manage prisoner property. For decades, he lived freely in Germany, working as a bank clerk, speaking rarely of the past. But when he was 93, German prosecutors charged him as an accessory to 300,000 murders. The trial drew international attention. Gröning did not deny his role. In fact, he confessed. "I saw the gas chambers," he said. "I saw the transports. I heard the screams. I was there." His defense was not innocence, but irrelevance. He claimed he was only a small cog, too insignificant to matter. But the court disagreed. Without cogs, the judge replied, the machine does not function. In 2016, Gröning was convicted. He died before serving a single day in prison. but the verdict itself became part of history, a moral victory proof that complicity cannot age out of responsibility. These late trials did more than convict, they rekindled memory. Younger generations born long after the war saw images of their grandparents' peers on trial for crimes committed before their parents were born. It was a reckoning not only with individuals, but with the question of collective guilt. How does a nation live with what it once allowed? Germany's younger citizens began visiting the killing sites, the ravines, the forests, the forgotten fields. School programs brought them to places like Babi Yar and Ponary, where the Einsatzgruppen had done their work. There, amid the quiet grass and rusted shell casings, they read the names of the towns erased from history. For many, it was their first encounter with the unvarnished truth. Meanwhile, forensic teams returned to those same places, digging carefully through the soil. Each discovery, each bone, each bullet casing confirmed the old reports. The dead were speaking again, their silence broken by science. In Minsk, researchers unearthed remnants of the sites where Einsatzgruppen units had executed tens of thousands of Jews. In one trench, they found the bullet-riddled skulls of children still clinging to the remnants of school uniforms. The findings match the Nazi field reports word for word. The past had left its evidence in layers of earth, waiting for someone to ask. For survivors who were still alive, these trials and excavations brought mixed feelings. Justice, after all, had taken a lifetime. Some said it was meaningless, that punishing a 90-year-old man could never restore what was lost. Others wept in court, saying that finally, at last, the world had heard them. One survivor, a woman who had been a child in Lithuania when her family was killed by Einsatzgruppe A, said at Reckonings trial, "We are not here for revenge. We are here so that no one will ever say, 'It did not happen.'" That was the purpose of these final reckonings. Not vengeance, not even closure, but preservation. The truth had to be spoken while voices still remained. The Einsatzgruppen were more than soldiers. They were the prototype of modern genocide. Educated men turned into managers of death. Their legacy stretched far beyond the war. Every subsequent atrocity from Cambodia to Rwanda echoed their methods: organization, dehumanization, and the rational language of extermination disguised as necessity. The late German trials were not just about the past, they were warnings about the future. As the last defendants died, the investigators followed them to the end. In 2019, the central office in Ludwigsburg still maintained open case files, yellowed pages, faded ink names scratched in pencil. The office refused to close them, even when all the suspects were long dead. "It is not about the living anymore," one investigator said. "It is about the record. The world must never again say it didn't know." By then, the survivors' generation was nearly gone. Those who remained spoke softly, their voices trembling but clear. They had lived long enough to see justice crawl out of the rubble. They had seen the executioners die of old age, yet still be named. For them, that naming was victory enough. And so, 70 years after the first bullets were fired in the forests of Eastern Europe, the final verdicts were read, not just in courts, but in classrooms, museums, and memorials. The reckoning had become education. The crimes of the Einsatzgruppen were no longer whispered in footnotes. They were taught as warnings. As the survivors passed, they left behind their stories, their testimonies, and their faith that remembrance would outlive them. And in that sense, they won. Because the true end of the Einsatzgruppen did not come with the gallows or the trials. It came when the world learned to look their history in the eye and refused to look away again. The earth remembers the unearthed graves of truth. The last witnesses grew old, the last defendants died, and the world moved on or tried to. But the earth never forgets. Decades after the war, long after the final trials had ended, the ground itself began to speak. Beneath the quiet fields of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, the evidence of the Einsatzgruppen still lay in silence, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. It began with a shovel. In the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, local farmers and construction crews started uncovering bones, thousands of them, while digging foundations or laying pipes. In Belarus, near the town of Mali Trostanets, a man digging a well-struck metal-then bone. He called the police, who found that the well had been dug directly through a mass grave. Inside were men, women, and children, all executed by gunfire, all buried together. Their shoes were still intact, their teeth perfectly preserved. For years, these graves had been rumors whispered among villagers who remembered the black uniformed men that came at dawn. But now, with new technology and open archives, those whispers became evidence. Forensic archaeologists arrived from Germany, Poland, France, and Israel. They used ground-penetrating radar aerial mapping and DNA testing. Everywhere they looked, they found the same thing: pits filled with the remains of the murdered, often exactly where Nazi reports had said they would be. The Einsatzgruppen had documented everything with bureaucratic precision. Each killing site had coordinates, daily counts, and progress reports filed to Berlin. The Nazis had thought that by burning documents and bodies, they could erase the record. They were wrong. The ground had kept its own archives. In Ukraine, near the town of Vinnytsia, an excavation revealed layers of human remains, over 9,000 bodies stacked in trenches. Among them were fragments of clothing toys and even coins minted in 1941. The bullets were German. The forensic teams confirmed what survivors had said. For decades, this had been an Einsatzgruppen operation. The official Nazi report from that region listed 8 1924 executed, a number eerily close to what was now unearthed. Further north in Latvia, archaeologists worked at the Rubble forest, where Einsatzgruppe A and local collaborators had killed more than 25,000 Jews from the Riga ghetto over 2 days in 1941. The trees there still grew, twisted their roots, tangled with fragments of bone. When the first shovels broke the surface, they found children's shoes, hair clips, eyeglass frames, a bullet casing from a German Mauser rifle. The soil was black with ash and fat. Even 80 years later, it still carried the smell of burned flesh when disturbed. And then there was Babi Yar. For half a century, the ravine outside Kyiv had been a wound without a monument. The Soviets, unwilling to acknowledge the specifically Jewish nature of the massacre, had turned it into a park covering the soil with grass and walkways. Beneath it lay 33 771 victims, the men, women, and children murdered by Paul Blobel's Einsatzkommando 4A in September 1941. For decades, people walked their dogs over the graves. Children played there. Lovers picnicked on the edge of the ravine. The ground was silent, but not peaceful. In the early 2000s, teams of researchers and rabbis began working to identify the exact boundaries of the massacre site. Using radar scans, they discovered that the original Soviet estimates had been wrong. The burial field was far larger, stretching beyond what anyone had imagined. The scans showed distinct layers of disturbed earth, each corresponding to the order of executions that had taken place in waves. The discovery reignited a conversation that had long been uncomfortable, the responsibility not only of the killers, but of those who had chosen not to remember. Babi Yar was no longer just a crime scene. It was a mirror reflecting the conscience of nations. As these graves emerged from obscurity, something else surfaced with them: the names of the forgotten. Using DNA testing and archival records, researchers began matching remains to surviving relatives. Families who had grown up with missing branches on their family trees suddenly had answers. It was devastating, but also healing. The dead were no longer anonymous. They were sons and daughters, mothers and fathers restored to history. In Lithuania, one excavation revealed a narrow escape tunnel dug by Jewish prisoners forced to burn corpses for the Einsatzgruppen during Operation 1005, Blobel's campaign to erase evidence. Archaeologists discovered it still intact beneath the forest floor. Inside were hand-dug walls, burned wooden supports, and the marks of human fingernails. Through that tunnel, 12 prisoners had escaped one night in 1944. For 70 years, their story had been dismissed as myth until the Earth itself proved it true. Each discovery brought a paradoxical mix of grief and vindication. For survivors and descendants, it confirmed what they had always known, that memory was not imagination. The graves were testimony carved into the planet. But the excavations were not just about history, they were about warning. Forensic teams documented every bullet, every bone, every layer of soil to build a permanent record, because denial still existed. There were still voices, faint but dangerous, that called the Holocaust exaggerated or false. To them, each new discovery was a refutation written in dust and bone. In 2016, a team in Belarus uncovered another mass grave near a village called Braune, an Einsatzgruppen site that had claimed 70,000 lives. Locals had known for years that something unspeakable lay beneath the pine forest. As the archaeologists exhumed the first layer, they found evidence that the Nazis had tried to destroy the graves, burned logs, bone ash, melted fragments of gold teeth. But even in their thoroughness, they had failed. The scientists could still read the story in the earth strata. First the bodies, then the fire, then the collapse of the pit. It was the same story everywhere. From Latvia to Moldova, from Poland to the Black Sea, the landscape of Eastern Europe had become a vast, unmarked necropolis. The Einsatzgruppen had turned nature into a graveyard, and now nature was revealing what they tried to hide. In Germany itself, construction workers occasionally unearthed fragments from the war. Sometimes an old bomb, sometimes something darker. In 1996, in the city of Riga, the skeleton of Heinrich Lohse, the Nazi administrator who had coordinated Einsatzgruppen operations in the Baltic, was accidentally uncovered by a bulldozer. His execution had been secret, his death unrecorded. For 50 years, the Earth had kept him hidden, waiting for this moment. When the news broke, survivors of the Baltic massacres came to the site. They placed stones and candles near the uncovered bones, not to honor him, but to mark the irony. "He thought he buried us," one old man said, "but it is he who was buried by history." Every grave, every skeleton, every artifact was a message that time could not erase. The world may forget, but the ground remembers. Historians often say, the Einsatzgruppen were the first stage of the Holocaust, the bridge between ideology and industry, between hatred and machinery. Their crimes were not faceless or abstract. They were intimate, personal. They looked their victims in the eye. They shot them one by one. And it was precisely that intimacy that made their legacy so haunting. When the last forensic reports were filed and the bones laid back to rest, one line stood out from the scientists' notes. The soil was mixed with ash and calcium human, and earth, now indistinguishable. It was true in more ways than one. The crimes of the Einsatzgruppen had seeped so deeply into the soil of Europe that the two could never again be fully separated. And so the ground tells its story in silence, in the tilt of a tree root, in the discoloration of the dirt, in the way rainwater pools where trenches once lay. Every year, new graves are found, and every time they are the same, truth reemerges, history is not past. It is buried, and it breathes. The Einsatzgruppen tried to erase their victims, but in the end, they erased themselves. Their monuments turned to dust, their graves forgotten, their names spoken only as warnings. The only thing that endures is the truth, the one thing they could never kill, because the earth remembers what men choose to forget, and it remembers forever. The bones beneath the parking lot. Franz's unspoken memory. History does not vanish. It only waits for someone to dig deep enough. In 2016, in the small French town of Le Vernet, a team of construction workers were expanding a supermarket parking lot when a bulldozer hit something solid. At first, they thought it was an old foundation stone, maybe debris from the war. But when the machine lifted, the soil bones tumbled out, dozens of them, then hundreds. Work stopped immediately. The site was sealed and archaeologists were called in. Within days, they realized they were standing atop an unmarked mass grave, one that no one in town had ever mentioned, one that was not supposed to exist. As the excavation widened, they uncovered nearly 300 skeletons. The bones were arranged in layers, intertwined, hurriedly buried. The bodies bore signs of execution gunshots to the skull hands bound with rusted wire. Coins dated from the 1940s. Buttons bore the insignia of German uniforms. But scattered among them were civilian items, rosaries, hairpins, fragments of children's shoes. The investigators soon realized this was not a German grave, it was a French one. Le Vernet had been a site of an internment camp during World War II, first run by the French Vichy government and later taken over by German forces. Thousands of Spanish refugees, Jewish families, and political dissidents had been held there. When the Germans withdrew in 1944, the camp vanished, its barracks torn down, its records, destroyed, its land repurposed. The survivors rarely spoke of it. France had rebuilt itself on the myth of resistance, not collaboration. Now beneath a parking lot that silence had cracked open. The bones were sent for forensic testing. DNA analysis confirmed a mix of origins: Eastern European, North African Jewish, and Spanish Republican. The victims had not been soldiers. They were civilians. Historians cross-referenced the find with wartime records and uncovered something chilling. The camp had briefly housed prisoners under the supervision of an SS detachment attached to Einsatzgruppe K, a mobile unit operating in occupied France in 1943. Its mission, according to German field orders, was special treatment of political elements and non-Aryan undesirables. No one in Le Vernet remembered that name. For decades, the town had lived in peace, its people unaware that beneath their streets lay the remains of those executed in the final months of the occupation. When news spread, locals were stunned. Some refused to believe it. There must be a mistake, one resident told reporters. That can't be here. But the evidence was undeniable. The skeletons bore German bullet patterns. Forensic experts even recovered fragments of a pistol grip stamped with the letters SS. The ravine that had once served as a waste pit had been used as a killing ground. After the war, the pit was filled, leveled, and eventually paved over when the town expanded. It became, like so many places in Europe, a literal foundation built atop forgetting. As the investigation deepened, more truths surfaced: uncomfortable, inconvenient, but necessary. Declassified archives in Paris revealed that the French police, under Vichy authority, had cooperated with the Germans in rounding up prisoners for the camp. Among those sent to Le Vernet were children from Jewish families seized in Toulouse and Spanish refugees accused of communist sympathies. Many were never registered in any database. They simply disappeared. For 70 years, no one had asked where they went. The discovery ignited a national debate. France, long proud of its resistance, heroes had always struggled to confront the reality of collaboration. The mass grave beneath Le Vernet was a wound reopened. Politicians called for memorials. Historians demanded accountability. Locals whispered about grandparents who knew something but said nothing. For the first time, the small town was forced to confront its buried history, literally and morally. Television crews came filming the excavation under the gray French sky. Rows of white tents covered the site. Forensic anthropologists worked quietly, brushing soil from skulls, cataloging bone fragments, photographing artifacts. Each discovery added another detail to a story the nation had long ignored. One archaeologist interviewed at the site said softly, "This is what denial looks like after 70 years. It's not words, it's concrete poured over bones." The image was too powerful to ignore. In 2017, President Emmanuel Macron visited the site. Standing beside the unearthed trench, he spoke not only of remembrance, but of responsibility. To bury truth is to become its accomplice, he said. France must know every part of its history, its glory, and its shame. His words echoed across Europe, where hundreds of other forgotten graves still slept beneath towns, fields, and roads. The Einsatzgruppen's legacy had not ended with Germany. It had infected the soil of every place they had passed through. Forensic scientists later confirmed that the Le Vernet grave was indeed linked to one of the Einsatzgruppen detachments operating in Western Europe in 1943. The victims had likely been prisoners shot during the retreat of German forces after Allied landings in the south. The unit's field reports discovered in Berlin archives contained a chilling line, "Special treatment of remaining camp elements completed." That was how bureaucratic murder looked on paper, and that line matched the number of bodies found beneath the parking lot almost exactly. The discovery changed the town forever. The supermarket was never rebuilt on that site. Instead, the land was turned into a memorial garden. The remains were reburied with ceremony in caskets marked with the Star of David, the Spanish Republican flag, and the tricolor of France. Priests, rabbis, and imams stood together over the graves. Bells rang from the nearby church. For the first time since 1944, silence became reverence, not denial. Yet beneath the solemn ceremony lay a quiet unease. How many other parking lots, schoolyards, and city squares across Europe hid the same truth? How many stories had been smoothed over by the tarmac of progress? The ground beneath Le Vernet had become a symbol, not just of atrocity, but of how societies build comfort on top of silence. Every time rain falls, there it darkens the soil as if the earth itself mourns what it once held. Archaeologists call this kind of site a negative monument. It doesn't rise into the sky, it sinks into the past. It reminds the living not of victory, but of complicity. And perhaps that is what the world still needs most. Not another statue to heroes, but a grave that refuses to stay hidden. As the sun set over the town that evening, the archaeologists covered the trenches. The earth, raw and dark, was still wet from recent rain. The wind blew softly across the field, rustling the plastic sheets, whispering over the bones that had waited so long to be found. In that moment, one of the researchers turned to a journalist and said, "We spend our lives studying what people do to each other. But this is what the earth does for us. It remembers. And that is the truth buried under every monument, every road, every stone in Europe. The ground remembers everything, even the things we choose to forget." The reckoning beneath Europe's skin, memory denial, and the weight of the past. Europe is beautiful when seen from above. Green valleys, stone villages, cities rebuilt for ruin. But beauty can be deceptive. Beneath its surface runs another continent, unseen. but ever present, a continent of graves, ashes, and silence. The Einsatzgruppen are gone, their uniforms rotted, their names scattered into the archives, yet their shadow lingers not as ghosts in the night, but as a pressure beneath the soil, beneath the stories people tell about who they are. The truth is that every nation built after the war carried its own version of forgetting. Germany institutionalized remembrance, turning shame into vigilance. France buried its complicity beneath myths of resistance. The Soviet Union recast its mass graves as symbols of victory, not of loss. And everywhere else, from Poland to Lithuania, from Hungary to Croatia, people struggled with the same wound, how to live among the bones of their neighbors. The Einsatzgruppen did not just murder people, they murdered the idea of separation between good and evil, between civilized and barbaric. Their crimes were committed not in the chaos of battle, but in daylight, on village roads with pens and typewriters and rosters. They showed the world that annihilation could be orderly, rational, even polite. That revelation still unsettles Europe's conscience. For decades after the war, silence was the easiest refuge. The survivors were too few, the witnesses too scarred, the nations too eager to rebuild. The continent paved over its trauma with highways, airports, and glass towers. But the ground never healed, it only hardened. And as each new generation asked questions, cracks began to form. In the 1960s, those cracks became fault lines. Young Germans flooded the streets, demanding to know what their parents had done. In France, intellectuals challenged the national myth that everyone had resisted. In Eastern Europe, secret archives began to open, revealing photographs too terrible to deny rows of men, women, and children kneeling before open pits. The faces were not strangers, they were local. The Einsatzgruppen had not come from another planet. They had relied on local collaborators, policemen, administrators, villagers who knew exactly where every Jewish family lived. And that fact was unbearable. It forced countries to confront not an alien evil, but one born from their own soil. Even in the 21st century, those questions remain unresolved. In Ukraine, in Lithuania, in Hungary, debates over memory still rage. Monuments rise, then fall. Some commemorate the victims, others the so-called heroes who aided the killers. Every stone laid becomes an argument. Every memorial is a battlefield between history and denial. But denial takes many forms. It does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hides behind words like complexity or context. Sometimes it looks like a family who simply stops talking about what their grandfather did. Yet the reckoning cannot be avoided forever. The deeper historians dig, the more the past pushes upward. In Latvia, farmers still plow up bullet casings each spring. In Belarus, rivers still carry fragments of bone after heavy rains. In Ukraine, wildflowers bloom over forgotten trenches. Nature does not discriminate, it remembers all equally. In Germany, remembrance has become a discipline, almost a form of national ethics. The country built memorials not only for the victims, but for the act of remembering itself, the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin, a field of gray concrete slabs, uneven, disorienting, without inscription. It is not meant to comfort, it is meant to disturb. Visitors walk among the slabs and feel lost, small, swallowed by silence. It is a landscape of absence, the physical opposite of forgetting. Still, even there, debates persist. How much guilt is enough? How long should it last? Should children carry the sins of their ancestors? The answers are as fractured as the continent itself. In the East, the reckoning came slower. The Soviet regime had preserved evidence but erased identity mass graves labeled victims of fascism with no mention of Jews. For decades, the Holocaust by bullets remained half remembered, half denied. Only after the Iron Curtain fell did scholars begin mapping the Einsatzgruppen's path town by town, grave by grave. The result was staggering: more than 2,000 killing sites across Eastern Europe. Each dot on the map marked a place where civilization had ended in a whisper, not a scream. And then came the next revelation: the collaboration, the everyday complicity. Teachers who handed over lists of students, priests who blessed the guns, neighbors who took over the houses of the murdered. The Einsatzgruppen may have pulled the triggers, but they could not have done it alone. The Holocaust was not only German, it was European. That truth is what makes the memory so heavy, because it means no one can claim innocence by geography. Today, tourists walk through quiet forests and old towns, unaware that beneath their feet lie the remnants of entire communities. The houses are gone, the synagogues burned, but the absence is palpable if you listen. Every town once had its own small Jewish world, children markets, laughter songs. The Einsatzgruppen erased those worlds in days, and Europe learned to live in the emptiness that followed. In some places, the silence has finally begun to break. Local volunteers have started tending forgotten cemeteries, placing small stones on unmarked graves. Artists and writers dedicate their work to lost villages, lost families. Museums built in former ghettos tell the stories that the archives could not capture: the smell of bread, the sound of prayer, the color of a child's scarf. It is a fragile kind of resurrection, but a necessary one, because the weight of the past is not measured only in guilt, it is also measured in responsibility. The responsibility to remember to teach, to refuse the comfort of amnesia. Europe's greatest moral achievement after 1945 was not prosperity or unity, it was remembrance. And yet even that achievement must be defended constantly. Memory, like democracy, is not permanent. It must be renewed every generation. The last survivors are gone now. Their testimonies survive in recordings, trembling voices describing the crack of rifles, the smell of pine needles, the cries of children. These voices are the continent's conscience. They remind us that history is not abstract. It has a sound, a face, a temperature. The Einsatzgruppen may have believed that time would bury them, that history would forget. But time did the opposite. It turned their crimes into mirrors that Europe cannot stop looking into. In Berlin, school children visit the Topography of Terror Museum, built on the site of the Gestapo headquarters. They walk through rooms filled with photographs of ordinary men in SS uniforms smiling at picnics between executions. The most chilling thing is not their cruelty, but their normality. They could be anyone. That is the final reckoning, not in the courts, not in the archives, but in the realization that evil never announces itself. It wears a uniform, a wedding ring, a gentle smile. It loves its children, feeds its dog, and then goes to work. The Einsatzgruppen were not monsters from myth. They were men from universities and suburbs. That is why they matter still, because they prove how thin the skin of civilization truly is. The reckoning beneath Europe's surface is not only historical, it is existential. Every time nationalism rises, every time hatred dresses itself in patriotism, every time people are told that some lives are worth less, the earth stirs. The bones beneath the parking lots and forests shift as if reminding us that forgetting is the first step toward repetition. And so Europe lives with its shadow, not as punishment, but as warning. It walks carefully, listens closely, remembers deliberately. Because the past is not behind us, it is beneath us, waiting, breathing, remembering. Echoes of ash and memory, how history ends and begins again. When the last trials ended, when the archives were sealed and the cameras stopped rolling, the world told itself that the story was complete. Justice had been done. History had been written, and the past had finally been laid to rest. But history never rests. It breathes. It hums beneath the skin of the living, carried quietly in our voices, our fears, our choices. The Einsatzgruppen may be gone, their names fading into dust, but their echoes remain woven into the very language of modern memory. Every generation inherits the same fragile promise: never again. It sounds absolute simple powerful, but never again is not a law of nature. It is an act of will renewed every time we remember. The moment memory falters, history begins again. The soldiers who marched into Eastern Europe in 1941 were not creatures of myth. They were human, educated, articulate, polite. They loved their children, read newspapers, wrote letters home. Many had studied philosophy, law, medicine. They were the sons of a cultured nation that prided itself on reason and order. And yet, they killed. Not in madness or frenzy, but in schedules and quotas. That is why their story is more than history, it is a warning. The Einsatzgruppen did not begin with hatred. They began with obedience, with the belief that morality could be suspended for a greater good, with the idea that some lives mattered less than others. Before the bullets came, the words, propaganda laws, and slogans that divided neighbor from neighbor. Before the executions came silence, the silence of those who looked away. That pattern has repeated itself in every century under every flag. Rwanda, Bosnia, Cambodia, Darfur, the same machinery, the same excuses, the same language of cleansing order destiny. The uniforms change, the ideology changes, but the impulse is the same. The faces of the killers could belong to anyone. The lesson of the Einsatzgruppen is not about Germany alone. It is about what humans are capable of when morality is replaced by loyalty, when truth becomes an inconvenience, when empathy yields to fear. The modern world still carries that danger. In every culture, in every decade, there are voices that whisper of purity, of belonging, of enemies who must be silenced for the good of the nation. Each time those words are spoken, the ground beneath Europe trembles slightly, as if the bones buried in its soil stir in warning. And the earth remembers. It remembers the trenches of Ukraine, the forests of Latvia, the ravines of Belarus. It remembers the echo of gunfire, the smell of burning hair, the silence that followed. Every spring, when flowers bloom above the old graves, the living walk unknowingly over what was once the end of the world. The story of the Einsatzgruppen does not end with executions or trials. It ends and begins again in the act of remembering. When a teacher opens a history book in Berlin and tells a classroom full of children that their city once led the machinery of death, when a survivor in Vilnius holds up a faded photograph and says, "These were my brothers, my sisters, my parents." When a student in Warsaw stands in the rain at a memorial, realizing that the empty space before them is not absence, but evidence. That is where history lives again, not in documents, but in empathy. In recent years, digital archives have mapped every known Einsatzgruppen site across Eastern Europe. Each dot on the map represents a tragedy, yet together they form something unexpected, a constellation, a galaxy of memory stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. From above, it looks almost like light, thousands of points shining in the darkness, the illumination of what was once hidden. It is tempting to think of history as a straight line from barbarism to civilization, from ignorance to enlightenment. But the truth is more circular. The same fears that built the killing squad still exist, only dressed in different clothes. The same instincts that divided us from them still find their way into our politics, our media, our daily lives. That is why remembering matters. Because memory is not nostalgia, it is armor. When we study the Einsatzgruppen, we are not just learning about death, we are learning how civilization unravels. It doesn't begin with murder, it begins with mockery, with bureaucracy, with laws that redefine who counts as human. It begins with ordinary people deciding that conscience is someone else's job. In 1941, the Einsatzgruppen fired their rifles into ravines. In 2025, the world has new weapons lies, disinformation algorithms that spread hate faster than any bullet. The method has changed, but the target is the same, the human capacity for empathy. If we forget the past, we become its echo. The earth beneath Europe's feet is layered with centuries of conflict, conquest, and mourning. But the layer that still bleeds, the layer of the Einsatzgruppen, is the most recent and perhaps the most dangerous. It is a reminder that progress does not mean immunity. The youngest generation now visits those sites not out of guilt, but out of curiosity, a hunger to understand how ordinary men became executioners. They stand in places like Babi Yar and Rubble, feeling the wind move through the trees, listening to the silence, trying to imagine. They cannot not fully. No one can. But that act of trying that struggle to imagine is itself an act of defiance against forgetting. Each memory preserved, each name recorded, each story retold is a small victory against the void that the Einsatzgruppen tried to create. They wanted not only to kill the living, but to erase the memory of their existence. They failed because history speaks through the persistence of the living, through the writers, the teachers, the filmmakers, the mothers who whisper to their children, "This happened, and it must never happen again." In a way, the Einsatzgruppen achieved the opposite of what they intended. They tried to make the world forget. Instead, they became the very reason the world remembers. In every generation, there are people who will try to build new myths of purity and belonging. And in every generation, there must be others, teachers, historians, ordinary citizens who dig through the lies the way archaeologists dig through soil, searching for bones, for truth, for the fragments of what we once destroyed. Because the real war never ended. It only changed its battlefield from forests and trenches to memory and meaning. When the last survivor dies, the burden of remembrance becomes ours. The question is not whether we will remember, but how. With guilt, with denial, or with courage. In the end, the story of the Einsatzgruppen is not a story about Nazis. It is a story about humanity, its brilliance and its blindness, its compassion and its cruelty. It is a story about how easily ordinary people can become extraordinary monsters when they stop seeing others as human. The historian's task is not to judge, but to warn, to hold a mirror to the present and say, "Look closely. The faces may have changed, but the pattern remains." And so, we return to where we began, to the question whispered at the edge of every killing field, every trial, every monument. What happens when the guns fall silent? The answer is this: the earth remembers, the names remain, and history waits, watching to see if we have learned anything at all. Because in the end, how history ends or begins again depends not on the dead, but on the living.